thank you very much, Flora, and thank you all for coming that late in the evening to hear about biodiversity. It's exciting to see you are interested in that. So biodiversity, as you all know, is the diversity of life at all levels. So talking about the diversity of ecosystems, species, populations, individuals, and genes. So it's a very familiar concept, right? It's something that you hear about in the news, that you see on the television. You know, Le Monde has its own, like, biodiversity page and so on. So it's something that is really familiar. Although it's very familiar to you, it might not be to you. It was not to your parents or grandparents when they were your age, because biodiversity is a very recent term. And it's a term that emerges in a particular context. It emerges in the context of biodiversity, of species loss and environmental changes. So it actually was first used in this conference in Washington, the National Forum on Biodiversity, from which this sentence as stated, where there was a first really big call or big wish to raise awareness on species extinction. So this sentence saying that the species extinction crisis is a threat to civilization, second only to the threat of nuclear war. So very, very strong sentence that was relayed by the media, by the press, and that started to spread the use of biodiversity, of the term biodiversity. So biodiversity is a very recent term, but and it's something that's familiar to you, and something that's also very familiar to you is that although it's a recent term, and there's awareness about biodiversity for only a very little time, it's something that's a result of a very long process of hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Okay, so this is all very familiar to you, but what you might not be familiar about is what researchers who work on biodiversity do. So that's what I'm going to try to show you, what researchers who work, so what biodiversity research is about, and give you this very broad overview, which I hope won't be too basic, but it might be. So I was not sure whether it was only life science or also maybe people coming from physics, or so it's. I
think it's the second. So don't worry.
Okay.
People come from very different backgrounds, from undergrad.
Okay. So biodiversity is a recent term, but research on biological diversity itself is, has been going on for many years, and it started in the 18th century with a big effort first to discover, classify, name, and count species on Earth, with people like Carl von Linné, Leclerc, Buffon, von Humboldt, and so on. There has been this effort to try to name things in the living organisms and what we see, but also in fossil records. So with people like Cuvier and so on, same thing in the 18th and 19th century, a big effort of discovery, of nomenclature, classifying, naming, and so on in the fossil record. This has been followed by a century of exploration, so big, trips to continue this big nomenclature and discovery of diversity with, people like Darwin, Wallace, Watson, and so on. And this has led to the description of broad patterns in biodiversity. So, it's, people were trying to find kind of general laws in the same way that there were general laws in physics and so on. We've tried to find some patterns that apply broadly to life. And the kind of patterns that have been discovered with all these explorations are things such as, if if I can do it, the fact that species richness is very unevenly distributed on Earth, so there's really striking differences in the distribution of species richness, and in particular a very big accumulation of species diversity in the tropics. And this uneven distribution of diversity is also something that's not only geographic, but something that we also see in the Tree of Life, and was summarized a while ago by this sentence by Aldan saying God has an inordinate fondness for beetles, right? Just observing that there's so many beetles on Earth compared to other organisms that are much more poor, and we see the same thing across the Tree of Life, where some groups of organisms, if we look for example at mammals, are really successful. So for example, we have a lot of rodents, and other groups are much less species rich. The other kind of patterns that was really, descriptive kind of observation. How does, biodiversity, how it's distributed in space, in time, and so on, and in ecological communities as well. This has been looked at. So how, for example, do individuals distribute across species in ecological communities? So there's this general pattern that arises, that communities are in general made of many rare and few abundant species, and the shape of this distribution is also something that's pretty general, and that has been recorded and plotted across many different groups of organisms in many different biomes, ecosystems, and so on. The other general laws that people have observed is an increase in species richness with geographic area and also with specific forms. In particular, this power law pattern, where we plot the log of species richness on log area. It follows a pretty straight line, and there's variations around that. There's also variations around the slope of this relationship, but even when we compare across very different organisms, the slope is pretty consistent, remarkably consistent. When observing the fossil record, there's also some real, big general trends that have been observed, such as the fact that diversity seems to reach a plateau between mass extinction events, leading to ideas such as equilibrium diversity, that there will be kind of a limited number of species that can be supported by the planet, and that is separated by mass extinction events. So those are really and it took a lot of time to come up with these, given the diversity, to come up with these general patterns of biodiversity that have been observed in the fossil record, in ecological communities, or more broadly at very broad geographic scales. And so this is just a basic observation, but then it's trying to understand these patterns that we have seen that has led to the development of a theory and kind of more process-based research on biodiversity. So trying to understand these biodiversity patterns that are to the development and theory, and the most obvious one, of course, is the theory, this Darwin's theory of evolution by common descent, right? So that's the most obvious one that you think about. So it's a really major thing that arises from biodiversity research. So, right, there's a big impact in biology on biodiversity research. It's really like observing this diversity of life that Darwin came up with his theory. So that was still verbal theory, and quantitative theories of biodiversity only arise very late, so really like in the 20th century. One of the first ones being MacArthur and Wilson's theory of island biogeography, which tried to explain this pattern that I showed before on how the number of species increases with a given area, and also given the distance of an island from a mainland. So that's one of the first quantitative theory where researchers really tried to have a mathematical expression of mathematical prediction of species richness. This theory has had still used a lot in the field, and there's expansion of this theory, which at the beginning didn't take into account evolutionary processes. That has led to another theory that had a lot of debate in the field, which is Hubel's neutral theory of biodiversity, which is kind of applying the same ideas of a neutral theory in evolution, but applied to biodiversity, and which has been very controversial because it makes this assumption of neutrality between species, which goes against everything that ecologists have done about looking at the specifics of their species. But it's one of the biggest efforts to give mathematical predictions for biodiversity, and it's still one of the models that gives the most really analytical mathematical predictions. Okay, so now what have been the big revolutions in the field? Because this is, kind of the aim of all that. So the big revolutions, the thing that have really have allowed to make jumps in the fields, of course, the genetic revolution. So this dates to Sanger in 1970, when we can start to have sequences so yeah, that's kind of we have the date where we can start to not only look at phenotypes and so on, but also have access to the genomes. The digital revolution, as also this has had impact everywhere, I guess, in science, but also in our field for sure, and the geospatial revolution. Okay, so what is this genetic revolution allowed to do? It has allowed to resolve phylogenetic relationships at very large scales, right? So it has allowed to go from this idea that there's a revolution by common descent, and to be able to now map or resolve this evolutionary relationship between species. So we can now not, even if we don't go in the fossil record, but we just sequence species that we see today from their molecular DNA sequence. We can reconstruct phylogenetic trees that give us a good handle on when speciation events happen, and try to relate these events of speciation to major abiotic events and so on. This genetic revolution has led to big surprises, and one of these big surprises, so like something that we were not expecting, was the discovery of a third domain of life, right? So this only dates back to not that old, right? Like 30 years or so on, 40 years, where the sequencing allowed to show that there was not only bacteria and us, but also a third domain of life. This has also led to a new vision of the tree of life. So we're not thinking anymore about something where something like Darwin plotted it with bifurcating trees, but something much more entangled, where maybe we don't see very well, right? It's okay. where maybe we can see like the tips of eukaryotes as bifurcating trees, but the idea now of a single common ancestor is changed toward an idea where there was a common ancestral community of primitive cells sharing a lot of genetic material, and that in which evolution didn't look anything like something that is just a bifurcating tree. So still, thanks to this genetic revolution, something that we were not expecting either is the extraordinary diversity of microbial life. So this has been also a bigger surprise. There's something like a million bacterial species in a gram of soil. There's more microbial than human cells in our bodies. Those are all things that we didn't know back, 30 years ago. And that's really changing our perception of biodiversity. This genetic revolution is also bringing the hope to do very large biodiversity inventories and monitoring through DNA barcoding, right? So there has been a lot of exploration, but we still have documented a very, very small fraction of diversity on Earth. There's still an enormous effort of just discovering and just plotting patterns in biodiversity research even today. And this genetic revolution is giving us the hope to really scale up the kind of monitoring of biodiversity that we can do. Now, in biodiversity research, because it has this strong link with society, since the emergence of this term through a conference that was meant to raise awareness on biodiversity, something that really has been important in this field is this increasing awareness of the implications of biodiversity for humans. So there's this big notion of ecosystem services given by biodiversity, by the provision of food, of raw materials, the regulation of ecosystem processes, the provision of fresh water, and so on. And this is something that is important because it's putting pressure on how research is being done, on a kind of pressure on applications of our field to society. So there's not only an impact or an importance of biodiversity on ecosystem services, but also on human health, and this has come with the discovery of microbial life, and in particular of the microbiome. So there's now this big awareness also that by biodiversity research we can maybe improve the way that we design health and deal with epidemics and so on. So this is really important because, as I was saying, there's this increasing need for predictions, scenarios of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So this, you can see like the big dates of biodiversity in 1992, the Rio Earth Summit, with the creation of a Convention of Biological Diversity. In 2002, the 189 countries who signed the Convention on Biological Diversity taken an engagement to reduce biodiversity loss by 2010. 2010, we have the International Year of Biodiversity. 2012, only two years ago, we have the creation of the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is supposed to make this bridge between the researchers and the politics, and for which there is really a need for concrete predictions in the same way that people working on climate change can give predictions on how temperature might change in the 20 or 30 years to come. So, so there's a big part of our field which is driven by this desire to predict. And so we have things like projections of biodiversity loss due to climate changes and so on. Well, I don't know what my concluding thing was about that, but the next thing that you know this talk is supposed to be about is what the vision that we can think of what could happen in the coming years for biodiversity research. Okay, so so that's where we can go crazy, right? I didn't go too crazy, though. Okay, so. What we can think might happen is that there is going to be a change that's going to come from space-based monitoring of biodiversity, where we start to have planes going on the top of forests and directly monitoring biodiversity through remote sensing. And so that's going to again upscale or really like upscale the kind of data set that we have. This is already going on, but it's going to keep on increasing. There's going to be a massive sequencing on life, not only on Earth but also in our bodies and in our cities. And we can think that this is going to be relayed by ground-based data collection facilitated by citizen sciences and relayed through social media, right? So even like things like barcoding could be done by individuals in their gardens and so on, and this might really change also the scale at which we can obtain data. So then something that might happen also is that we're going to have a self-adapting tree of life. That's something that's at the moment also really restricting in the field, is how to understand how the biodiversity emerged thanks to these trees. And we can think that there will be the ability to have directly something that goes from the data collection to implementation in large databases and directly kind of updates the vision we have of a tree of life, whether it will look like this, or like that. So in the end, this will give us things like Google Maps of biodiversity, where we can select a given place on Earth and zoom on this place on Earth and have an inventory of biodiversity, which will look either something like that, or like that. And these big data sets will serve as benchmark data sets to parameterize global models aimed at predicting the structure or functioning of ecosystems to guide the decisions of conservationists and policymakers, so kind of like big machineries that allow to give the same predictions for biodiversity as we have for climate. We'll have models aimed at predicting the structure and functioning of our microbiomes to guide our eating health habits and medical treatments. And we'll have models and by predicting the structure or functioning of microbial communities in our buildings and cities to guide architectural design and urban policies. So that's where it might look like everything about the future of biodiversity research is something that's applied to our society, either in terms of biodiversity conservation, health, or the design of our cities. But this will all rest on our ability to build these models intelligently, and so on our fundamental understanding of the processes under the pattern. So I just put this slide there because I didn't want to end up on something that looked like everything about biodiversity research is something that's driven by desires to predict and to be applied. So I think I probably went super fast, right? But to conclude, I think biodiversity research is a field that has led and will continue to lead to major discoveries and big surprises. It's a dynamic research area really connected with society, and it will continue to be more and more interdisciplinary. And I guess here it's not really obvious, maybe from what I've presented, but yeah, I think that's about it.
So we have 15 minutes for questions, or less depending on what?
I'm wondering, how do you define the boundaries of one species to another, especially in terms of genetics and bacteria?
So species concept specifically in bacteria?
Well, yes, so when you say that there's an explosion of diversity in bacteria, mostly due to genetics and like sequencing of bacteria, but how do we know like this is one species and this is another species, and they're not just the same species with, say, different, slightly different genetic makeup? You know, there's high diversity within species within bacteria.
So what I said is that that thanks to the genetics, we were able to see something that we didn't see before, right? So it's not the genetics that made the diversity of. I'm not sure that. Just to make this point, and then so the way it's done is mostly through sequence similarity. But there is a lot of divergence. So when you look at this is all microbial, right? When I showed the tree of the three domains of life, right? This is all microbial, and the divergence you have between something here and something here is enormous. It's much bigger than the divergence we have, between us and fish and so on, right? So there's really, it's not like one species that that, I don't know if it was your question, right? But the divergence is enormous. So the way then that the species are recognized is either by clumping things by sequence similarity, or by using models of either ecotypes or of the way that genes coalesce and so on, that we can distinguish or decide what we decide is a species. But it's still something that is pretty arbitrary the way that it's done. Does it answer your question? I'm not sure.
I'm thinking more like fine-grained, so like how you define something as E. coli and something as like Pseudomonas, when say Pseudomonas has 10% of the genome is all accessory genome and plastic, and it can be there or not be there, and some change. So when you have like 90% is only similar in all one species, like how do you make that line between two highly related species when even that, Pseudomonas and E. coli usually apart in bacteria, but in the sequence level they're not so much different.
So it depends which sequence you will be looking at, right? So you will have some sequences that would be even identical, that would even be like transferred from one to the other, right? From which you cannot tell anything, but the sequence, most of the, at least the OTU definition that we have is based on sequences that are more conserved. So like 16S and so on. In this case, Pseudomonas and whichever one, E. coli, would be differentiated by that, by our sequence similarity approaches.
Yeah, so it's a bit connected to Matt's question, but and due to the fact that the definition of species is pretty arbitrary and depends on the markers that you use and what you decide to find. And I was thinking, so now the trend is to go towards, to also investigate like functional diversity. And so what's the future of biodiversity in a field where, well, more and more knowing that species A is here and species B is there is good, but it's even maybe more valuable for society and for health to know actually what it's doing. So do we really care that much about knowing diversity in terms of organisms, or is it more interesting to go towards what's the diversity in terms of functions that they, and would we be able to apply exactly the same methods that we used to for classical biodiversity to functional diversity, and instead of having maps of a Google map of rodents, we have a Google map of functions?
Yeah, no, that's true. I should have had that in this map of well, I'm not going to find it again, doesn't matter. But in this Google map, I put the genes. Where is it? But yeah, I should have put the function as well, definitively. And in these models, these global ecosystem models that are going to be developed, the focus is really on functions. So the way that the model is done is on grouping functional, on working on functional groups, and not at all on individuals, species, and so on, which for ecosystem functioning doesn't matter. But that's the direction that is being taken for these particular models. And then in terms of it's not like they're not mutually exclusive either, right? So that could be this all like genotype to phenotype mapping that could allow something like that, right? To use even the genes, because it will be easier to get as data than function, but to use that information to infer something about function.
Yeah, this is connected to what Flora said. Now that I was interested in this thing of the ecosystem services, I was wondering if you can tell us how did this concept appear and what conditions, and what do you think it will bring for biodiversity itself in the future? Is it a good thing or bad?
Okay, so the story of how the term itself emerged and all that stuff, I don't know.
Because it's weird. At some point we decided that biodiversity was good for us, and now all the researchers are saying, oh, but we are looking at services, so it's good for us, and we have to preserve that. But it's a new thing, right? It was not really what was pushing researchers in the beginning.
Yeah, so it's part of all these things that are coming along with the awareness about species loss and so on. And the way that it emerged, I think, is by people doing conservation and want to find a way to best preserve biodiversity by saying it's useful to us, and it's true, right? It's useful to us. Now, whether this was a good move to protect biodiversity, that's not true at all, because you can think in a lot of cases where the value of the monetary value of keeping one place will be much less than what you can get economically from an industry that is thriving. So whether it has been a good move for the conservation of biodiversity, that's not obvious. But I think it comes from that. It's come from saying that if we don't put dollars in front of species, then nobody will care ever. That's where it comes from. Yeah,
Yeah, vas-y, vas-y. Vas-y.
You told us about the future of biodiversity research, but what about the future of biodiversity itself? Do you think that there will be less species or more?
So whether there will be more or less species?
Yes, for example.
Less?
But I mean, given the impact of humanity on the environment, do you think that maybe some species could adapt and more species could appear due to this impact?
So the pace of speciation is about, like 0.1 per million of year per lineage. So before, I'm not saying that there are not processes that can lead to a faster divergence and faster speciation, but still the time scale at which these kind of things happen are much longer than the impact that we have. So yeah, that's something that is good to think about. How, if we're going to impact the environment, how can we impact it in a way that maybe is going to foster the differentiation and genetic divergence and so on, but we cannot think that it will allow to maybe have like more speciation than the extinction that can be driven by human impacts.
Maybe we'll have some clue in the next talk with synthetic biology bringing some new biodiversity.
Good transition. But there was another question? Yes, Patrick.
So much of your vision of the future involves these massive data sets and quantitative analysis. And so it's the future of the science, but we also need to think about what's the future scientists. What are they going to look like? What do you see as the kinds of people that are going to need to be doing this research, and how do we make them? How do we train them?
Yeah, so we're going to need very smart people, right? Because they're going to need to be able to deal with this huge amount of data. So with bioinformatics and so on, they're going to need to work with models, inference tools, which become increasingly complicated. A lot of like weird statistics. I think. So how we're going to train them? Through interdisciplinarity, so I guess here is a good place to say that. But I really mean it, especially for our field. It's obvious that we're going to need people that are not going to be specialized in everything, because it's not possible, but that will need to be able to speak to one another, and that might be one of the trainings that needs to be done from early on. The ability to communicate and to be able to work with mathematicians, with geneticists, with physicists, everything. So yeah, I think that's how I see the people that we will need.
And so, related to that question and the idea of the pace of speciation, is the pace at which we are increasingly producing data faster than the pace at which we are actually able to treat it?
At the moment,
do you
yes,
have the
I
feeling
think
that we're producing too much regarding what we are able, as the way we are able to treat
well,
it?
we are also improving the way to treat it. So I think we'll keep up at some point. So I think there's still a lot of diversity to be discovered and a lot of data missing. I mean, we're increasing it, but for example, look at fossil data. There's a lot that could be seen in fossils where there's no effort made. There's still an enormous amount of data that needs to be collected. So the pace at which we are accumulating it, maybe we don't know how to deal with it yet, but I think it will keep up, hopefully.
And if I can comment on that, I think that the more data you have, the more questions you also have. So it's really interesting to also increase the data, even if you don't know what you're going to do with it, because then you don't.
We might have other big surprises. The fourth domain of life.
Last question? Okay, thank you.
Okay,